The Gospel of Mark, which is one of the four ancient accounts of Jesus' ministry, which the church has turned to for 2 millennia or so, you might say, to learn about and encounter the person of Jesus, is known, among other things, and among the other Gospels, for its rather breathless pace. Once you're made aware of this, actually it's hard not to notice, and I may have ruined your reading of Mark a little bit. The word "boothus," Greek pronouncers can correct me on that. We don't speak that anymore. Uthus, it's usually translated as something like immediately or at once. I noticed in this little translation I put up "straight away" is up there as an old school translation for this. Occurs no fewer than 40 times in the 15 chapters of Mark, and 11 times in the first chapter alone. So it's, and this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and immediately, and at once. Jesus is up to a lot of things. By the time we are 20 verses into the first chapter, Jesus has been introduced, baptized by John the Baptist, thrust out in the wilderness to be tempted by the devil for 40 days, and called 4 fishermen to be his disciples. Do they accept? Yes, immediately. In the next 11 verses, Jesus goes to a town called Capernaum, preaches in the synagogue to great effect, casts an unruly demon out of a man there, and then goes to the house of 2 of his disciples, Simon and Andrew, where he immediately heals their sick mother-in-law. All right, we pick up the story in verse 32. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. End scene, next verse. Very shortly thereafter, right? That was at sundown. In the morning, while it was still not dark, very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. Clicker advanced. Simon, one of his disciples, a new disciple, and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." Yeah. Jesus answered, but he answered, you might say, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns." Now, I've realized over the span of some years now, and with at least some of that realization kind of congealing around the first time I spent some time with this text, that I'm a pretty serious people pleaser. I want to be wanted. I want to be considered valuable, and not just considered valuable, I suppose, but actually valuable, right? I want to be valuable, I want to be useful, I want to be of some good for those around me. Indeed, it may be something on the order of a basic, or at least rather normal human desire to want to be, useful, valuable, desire, satisfying other people's needs. I have some reason to think that it's a bit warped in me, perhaps not in perfect proportion like the rest of you, entangled with a few other things. Maybe some of you, are not perfectly calibrated that way too. Jesus, I suspect, though I'm not going to make a case here exactly, probably also has some species of this desire. He wants to do good, he wants to be useful to people. Indeed, he seems to have that in considerable depth. Jesus is often found loving people rather extravagantly. Jesus is often showing kind of a depth of compassion. Matt talked about that a few weeks ago. That's really pretty striking. So I think Jesus is not necessarily out of this framework of wanting to, be valuable, useful, do good to those around him. Indeed, he spent what we can probably imagine was the better part of the previous evening healing people, casting out demons, serving them in pretty tangible ways. That said, Jesus couldn't be really very much clear at all about his plan not to please any of the people involved in this mourning in Capernaum. So we'll show them again. This is the opposition. His "everyone is searching for you." Aha, let's go to one of the neighboring towns, right? His disciples seem to expect that he'll return with them once they find him. So he's not pleasing them. He's not satisfying their expectations. And he's clearly not pleasing the folks who are reportedly seeking him. Everyone. Everyone, right? One has the impression that when he is sought by everyone the next morning, that they don't quite think his work is done there. Now, it's not that Jesus isn't going to please anyone ever again, do things that they found valuable or desirable or useful one way or another. I think we will see he was going to continue to heal them of their diseases, cast out demons, things of that sort. In fact, that's where the sentence goes. Let us go to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim, the word is just there, proclaim, but it made it clear that he's going to proclaim the good news of God there also, for this is what I came out to do. And this seems like a reasonable enough rationale. And that is, for what it's worth, what Mark narrates next. Jesus travels around the region of Galilee, he heals a leper, he preaches, he casts out demons, and he returns some days later to Capernaum again, where some of you may know the story. A large crowd gathers again, so large that they have to lower a guy through the roof to gain access to him. Right? So Jesus isn't apparently abandoning these needy folks for all time. But how, says people pleaser me, does a guy decide in the first place to leave folks, at least some of whom we can assume are genuinely needy, and who are asking for him to do good, even very good things? Heal the sick, cast out demons, proclaim the good news of God, things that he's already proved capable, and at least the night before, willing to do. Now, there may be folks who are equally, if not more, in need of him, people who may regard Jesus as even more valuable than these folks in Capernaum. Maybe there's a better audience to be had elsewhere. But there are also some stories in the Gospels, especially one set in Jesus' hometown, some hometown of Nazareth, where he's rejected by the people, and he somehow escapes being thrown off a cliff. Right? So why not go with the sure thing and stay with these folks who are desperate for more Jesus, desperate for more of the good things that Jesus has been doing? Is it a PR strategy? Leave them wanting more. We want the gold iPhone. Once you get it, I can't speak to those things. But let me pose the question this way. How many of you, having healed, let's say, several dozen people the night before, pretty good night, would decide to beat it out of town the next morning when another half dozen people say, we want your healing? Right? If we are able to kind of escape the frame of people-pleasing as a motivation, kind of bracket that all together, it seems rather cruel, perhaps, to deny people seeking good things that you're able to provide from getting them from you. How does somebody decide something like this? How does Jesus decide such a thing? And that's the question we'll pick up in just a minute. Watch Matt's cool graphic. I just put it in, it does it. Let me first reorient you. Today is part of a teaching series on the person of Jesus. We've been in for a month or so. Is Jesus back up there? Does he go away immediately?
You can bring him back.
He's probably on a timer. There
he is.
There he is. All right. I'm going to focus on an aspect of the character of Jesus that we've seen in any number of the narratives in the Gospels that's cropped up, I think, in one way or another in all of the talks of the series, and I'll draw them out just briefly here. We might put it, there it goes, it's a slow fade, there it is. Jesus does exactly what is expected of him. Not only does he fulfill everyone's hopes, expectations, and desires, but he does so in ways that everyone is more or less expecting. Not so. Watch, it'll fall apart.
Wow.
It's quite the opposite, right? Jesus is regularly, even perpetually, surprising to those around him, and perhaps especially so to those who share his social and religious background. We've seen this aspect, or perhaps this consequence, of Jesus' way of being in a few different ways. Asha talked 2 weeks ago about Jesus' unexpected, culturally disapproved of heart for non-Jews, an occupying Roman centurion, a Samaritan woman, and other outsiders, those who would be kept away from the worship of God through the temple economy, the teachings of certain religious leaders. Matt made a similar point when he identified in his talks the scandal of Jesus' nearness to and compassion for social outcasts such as prostitutes, traitorous tax collectors, the sick, the socially and religiously unclean. In those cases, Jesus' unexpectedness, his otherness, if you will, is seen in his divergence from his social and religious context in the matter of whom he associates with. Sometimes this surprise is experienced as an unaccountably good thing. Wait, you want to stay at my house? Come to dinner with me, like hang out with my disreputable friends. Other times, and among other people sometimes at the same time, Jesus seeking or admitting fellowship, such folks, engenders no small amount of grumbling. And they do, of course, end up killing him. Spoiler alert. Josh, last week, explored another aspect of Jesus' otherness in a talk on the friendship of Jesus, where he said, oftentimes Jesus appears to be deliberately elusive as a communicator. He speaks in parables, speech that's less than abundantly clear, and that demands further interaction in order to become intelligible and useful. And I'll throw a stunning quote there that I won't read. Indeed, one has the sense that this regular mode of Jesus' communication is experienced by his hearers as at least initially rather less than ideal. Confusing, surprising, perhaps to the point of offense. It's clear that not everybody makes it through to the other side here. Jesus is unaccountably strange, and that's as far as it gets for any number of people who encounter him. Now, all of these cases and more fit quite nicely in the framework that Matt laid out in the introductory talk, a talk that explored the theological idea of incarnation, that's incarnate. I'll take that away from this. It's not as good uncooked anyway. Let's really trust the farm. Incarnate, right? No. Okay. Jesus in incarnation, the Eugene Peterson message paraphrase says Jesus moves into the neighborhood. He doesn't just take a house on the street where you see him mow the lawn occasionally, but he moves so near as to share meals with folks. He reclines in their homes, which is a setting of considerable intimacy in the ancient world. He's near enough to touch sick and ritually unclean people in order to heal them. So Matt explored that quite a bit in the talk on nearness, but also pointed out he's not only near, he's also different in the settings in which he's found. He sticks out. He does things that other people don't do and often don't understand. He says things that other people wouldn't say or can't imagine saying, or regard as highly suspect. He meets us where we are, but he also stands out. You might say he's a better sort of human. You might even say that he's an ideal human, the way humans ought to look or do things or be. But that is not to say that everyone receives him that way, and I suspect that none of us receives him that way all the time either. So even though Jesus is as near as human flesh, kindred human flesh, he's an unmistakable other in his ways of acting and speaking. And it's that otherness that Jesus brings to bear on the neighborhood and the neighbors that I think underlies why we care about him at all. If he were just like us, we wouldn't be worshiping and following him. Right? There's an otherness, there's a thing that sticks out, there's a thing that points to difference, and that's the difference that we pursue. Jesus' otherness underlies what's impactful about him, as well as, I think, our rejection of him in the many ways and degrees in which that comes. Now, so this is about the otherness of Jesus. Pasted it right in there, see? Part of the series. There are a number of ways of accounting for Jesus' otherness. The early church settled on a description of Jesus after some wrangling as fully God and fully man. And insofar as we wouldn't describe anyone else who's ever walked the earth as fully God and fully man, we might say that we would expect different things from a being like that. And that is a way that folks in the church have sometimes expressed Jesus' difference. But I think it's instructive that Jesus never really describes his difference that way, ontologically, if you will. He never suggests that his difference is because he's a different kind of being. Something along the lines of, I'm a special sort of being. I do things that special sorts of beings do. It doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't regard himself, it seems like at points, as ontologically different, a different kind of being. He uses the title, for example, Son of Man, that seems to refer to a unique status or role. But when Jesus' otherness is thematized, when people are like, Jesus, what's the deal? He describes his difference, his otherness, as a result of his relationship and the quality of his relationship with God the Father. So it's not only or merely a matter of who he is, but especially, and this is what he draws attention to, what he does, the way in which he operates. Now, there are several scenes in the gospel that I call what the hell Jesus kind of scenes, right? Jesus does something and people think, hell's in the Bible, right? We can use that word. See there? I'll take it off the Brit Testament Pharisees. There are several scenes, especially in the Gospel of John, that seem to be concerned with this kind of question, like Jesus, what's the deal? Incidentally, But relatedly, Silas, my 4-year-old son, found one of the little kiddo bags in the back to do some coloring at the end, which was one of these scenes where Jesus has healed someone and it's religiously disapproved of, and there, some Pharisee guys frowning. And Silas took it home and was asking my wife, Michelle, why are they frowning? He just healed this guy. And he changed their frowns into smiles. It's good. Where do we lose that? That's good. That's the right instinct. This is a good thing. Why are these guys dumb? That's important relating to Jesus insight. So in John 5, we have one of these things happening. Jesus has healed a man on the Sabbath. The way, I won't read you the whole story, the way that it goes down is Jesus tells him to pick up his mat and walk. And they see the guy, some religious leaders of some sort, see him carrying his mat, which is work on Sabbath. That's the thing. What's happened here? He says, oh, well, Jesus healed me, so now I'm walking. So they're unhappy with this. And John also throws in, Jesus has been calling God his own Father. So here we have Jesus doing something and saying something unobjectionable. Jesus answers them when they say in their own way, what the hell, Jesus? He says, very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. We see another one of these in John 8. He said something about his going away. They're not going to find him. It seems like he's talking about ascending to heaven, but the people are confused. What, you're going to kill yourself, they suggest? What do you mean? Why are you such a weirdo? Or perhaps, who are you? Jesus says, I declare to the world, I talk strangely, what I have heard from the one who sent me. I do nothing on my own, but I speak these things as the Father instructed me, and the one who sent me is with me. Jesus suggests that the key to his weirdness, his otherness, is what he has seen or heard from, what he's been instructed to do by the Father. It's something a bit different than, hey, I'm the Son of God, that's why I came from heaven, it's different up there, I'm God, I'm different. He explains his difference, at least as far as his socially and culturally kind of inscrutable words and actions go, as the result of a kind of dynamic relationship with his Father. It's the quality of this relationship with the Father, I think, that liberates Jesus from his, perhaps, temptation to people-pleasing, or even from the rather more neutral and usual human way of assessing a situation and formulating kind of a suitable response. So, again, this contrast that caught my attention. Everyone is searching for you. Let's go somewhere else. I think you only get this kind of result, and without thinking that Jesus is as bad as they say he is, if you add something else to the picture. Jesus has some other information that or some other influence besides in-the-moment assessment, besides response simply to express need or desire. I think the reason Jesus firmly and immediately resists the kind of implication of the disciples' report of the people's search is that he sees what his Father is doing, and his Father has other plans. Now, if you've been with us here for some of the earlier talks in the series, you may recall that we've emphasized or presented one of the goals of this series as something of a supplement or a counterpoint to just such a dynamic understanding of following God. Now, we emphasize in many ways here at UCB the dynamic relationship of following Jesus. I started putting this on the screen years ago, and now it's everywhere, right? My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. We've talked about having this series be a way of supplementing this kind of dynamic understanding with some ideas about the character of Jesus. Now, we do that perhaps leaning against the kind of character of the magic 8-ball Jesus approach. Should I marry that girl? Yes, okay, good, thank you, Jesus, right. I found a place online, which you'll go find this evening, where you can type in what you want, and we'll put it on magic 8-ball for you. Go to Yale. Oh, okay. Buy that fixer-upper. That's fine. All right, we don't need to go through this. So one of the aims of the series has been to put this kind of dynamic following, this kind of shake the Jesus ball, and see how it would direct you in a context, to highlight some aspects of Jesus' character, or perhaps to explore the person of Jesus with regard to the sorts of things we might see him tend to do. It's not just that we're seeking to follow him, but it's a matter of who, the kind of person we're following. By giving attention to the sorts of things that he tends to do, flowing out of the person that he is, we enrich our following, and I think we gain some footholds on the kind of formation that our following of Jesus might produce, and vice versa. If we give attention to the kinds of formation that might enable us to follow Jesus better, we're going to follow Jesus better, right? There's a relationship between this kind of dynamic and the kind of forms in which the dynamic leading of Jesus is experienced, and where we become formed to be the kind of people to experience that dynamic leading. Which is to say, I'm concerned here with the decision that I'm not concerned with the decision that Jesus makes in Capernaum as such. It's no longer important to us whether Jesus stays in Capernaum that morning or goes to the neighboring villages. It's rather a question of how he makes that decision. Leave Capernaum. I don't see Capernaum a magic 8-ball moment for Jesus' relationship to the Father. I think the scene actually discloses something about Jesus' character, the sort of person we're following, and it's a character we're called to imitate, that we might be like him. Now, I think the dynamism of Jesus' relationship with and direction by God, the thing that explains his difference most fundamentally, happens in the context of a certain posture and a certain practice. I think Jesus experiences the dynamism of relationship to God in his regular practice of prayer. You'll notice, in Mark 1, he's at a big night of ministry, the whole town. Many healed, many demons cast out. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. That's where he is. That's the preparation, the kind of place of formation that conditions his meeting of the disciples when they turn up with another prayer, or with a request. That's the place he's in when he's presented with human need, with an opportunity or a temptation to please people. He's in a context where he's being formed and led by God. You see this, a similar notice in an early chapter of Luke. Jesus calls Peter to follow him, heals a leper, and then we have this summary verse. Now more than ever, still early, but things are getting big. Now more than ever, the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather to hear him and to be cured of their diseases. But he would withdraw to deserted places and pray. The would withdraw, this is trying to reflect, it's a couple of participles with an imperfect. It means ongoing, regular, habitual action. Right? Jesus engages in this ministry, a lot of things are happening. And Jesus would often, continually, habitually withdraw to deserted places and pray. In Luke 6, there's a showdown on the Sabbath in the synagogue. There's a man with a withered hand. Luke, in this case, sets it up. There's a man with a withered hand. There's some scribes and Pharisees in the house. They're waiting for Jesus to screw something up. Is he going to do it? Withered hand guy. Jesus, scribes. He does it, right? He heals the guy. They were, and I quote, filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So Jesus is labeled as an outsider here in no uncertain terms. Maybe, just maybe, this is correlated with what follows. Maybe Jesus wants to bring others into this kind of outsider way of living. So, next verse. During those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples. He chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Now this is presumably a rather major decision, choosing the folks who will spend the next several years as Jesus' intimates, traveling with him. It's the sort of thing we might expect Jesus to pray about. If any time, he's going to pray about that. But it's the only time, I think, besides Jesus' prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane on the evening before he's killed, and I'm leaving that part of things to Sarah, who's going to talk for a couple weeks. You're looking forward to that. Besides that time, I think it's the only time that there's any kind of correlation between Jesus praying and like a big decision or big event. Otherwise, I think we have the impression that Jesus is doing this very regularly. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but all of these places, Jesus is, he's dismissed the crowds, he goes up by himself to pray, he goes not to pray, he's praying, this happens, he's praying, Jesus is praying, and this person said this, it's kind of sewn in as something that Jesus does. We also have the sense, maybe, that Jesus is fitting this into his life kind of on purpose. We have some of these time markers that maybe are not just throwaways. In the morning, from our text that we've already read, while it was still very dark, he got up. Right? This is a little heavy-handed. It's very marked, right? Pay attention. I'm going to use the word very, right? It was sunrise when he started, or sunset when he started ministering the night before. Now it's still dark. It's very dark. It's not even about to be day. Jesus is up. He's praying. Or like in Matthew, after he had dismissed the crowds, he has a certain ministry event. Then he went up by the mountain himself to pray. We're not given the impression in any of these prayer verses that Jesus is spending, days and days and days praying. He's fitting it in. He's putting it into the ministry he's doing. Now, spending days and days praying is great. But I think that Jesus' life looks more like ours, or we're meant to think it looks more like ours in the sort of time that we have to pray than not. Luke 6, he spent the night in prayer. So prayer for Jesus, I suggest, is not just the setting in which he can bring out the 8-ball. I think it's a place of intimacy for him. I think it's a place of communion with the Father, processing of things that have happened during his day. It's especially kind of smashed up against these kind of major ministry things happening. It's a time of intercession. He tells Peter at one point, I've prayed for you, thus and so is happening. It's a time of formation. Jesus doesn't pray, I think, because he is God, right? God praying to God. I think Jesus prays, though he is God, because he's a human being and he has a regular practice of being with the Father, processing his life with the Father, seeking the Father's direction, asking for the Father's intervention, his resources, his empowerment in the life he's living in the lives of those around him. Now, why do I think this? We actually have very little indication of what happens in these times of Jesus' prayer. We have one time he's praying very early in Luke, and a voice answers from heaven. That seems to be designed to let us in a little bit on what the content of prayer might be like for Jesus. The voice says, as you may know, you are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. I think that might be the sort of thing Jesus might hear in prayer, the sort of thing he's having in prayer. But mostly I'm analogizing. I'm analogizing from my best, or my almost best times of prayer, in which all of these things happen, right? In which I can process things that are happening in my life, in which I can intercede, ask God's intervention in things that I'm dealing with, that other people are dealing with. I can ask to be formed and changed. I'm doing some repenting. I think theologically, we think Jesus isn't doing much repenting. But I think analogously, by being invited into the practice of prayer, I'm guessing as to how this works for Jesus and as to how his formation takes place there. Which is to say, very little of it indeed, has a magic involved character to it. The way in which Jesus is being led has very much to do with the way that his appetites and desires and planning are being formed in seeing what the Father's doing. So Jesus' practice of prayer, I think, both produces his otherness in the things that he hears and sees from the Father, and it also sustains it. Jesus' experience of the Father's love, his processing of the events of the day to come, his intercession for those in and around his life, pays dividends in the kind of personal wholeness, freedom from the desires and expectations of those around him, and the, I think, otherwise determinative force that they might exert if he weren't hemmed in and constituted by the formation of a relationship with time spent in the presence of the Father. Now, I trust that you agree with that, and you'll begin a robust prayer practice if we don't have one. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't develop the picture just a little bit further, and to say what's perhaps implicit, make it a little bit explicit. Jesus' practice of prayer, I think, reflects and enacts a certain posture that may even give us the best insight of all into Jesus' character, the kind of person he is. Jesus places himself perpetually under the influence of the Father. He comes under his care and his direction, lives out of that relationship, is constituted in his thinking and speaking and acting by it. So I think what especially makes Jesus stand out, why he's experienced as such a decided other in the human community, is not so much that he hears the Father in this relational interaction that we may only theorize about. The world's experience of Jesus' remarkable otherness happens at the place in our world where what he hears, perhaps in private, is borne out in his public obedience. So the otherness of Jesus, I think, is principally a function of the obedience of Jesus. The difference is not so much what Jesus hears, but the obeying of what he hears. That's where it comes out into the open and is experienced as difference. We experience this otherness when he obediently, presumably, speaks in parables, inviting those who would hear him to the risk of relationship with him. When he speaks what he hears, things that are true, but does not fine-tune it to our sensibilities and rather risks offending them. This is Jesus not trying to please, but Jesus being obedient, I think. We experience his otherness when, in obedience to the Father, he does things that we wouldn't do, that in some cases we wouldn't want him to do, that we fear might implicate us as his followers in doing likewise. We see Jesus as an other, I think, when he obediently leaves Capernaum that morning, contrary to popular demand. When he apparently breaks one of Israel's most central and distinctive laws in the synagogue, in the presence of religious leaders itching for him to out himself by healing the man with the withered hand. Jesus is not present to please people, really, or to please us, but instead to heal us. And it's that obedient otherness bent on changing us, those of us who are both victims and perpetrators of disobedience to the Father. He is present to love us and those around us in ways of depth and extent beyond what we seek or expect or might be pleased by. It's the obedience that flows out of his hearing that creates the disjunction. I should say, Sarah will be speaking in 2 weeks on Jesus' obedience to death. So I'm leaving all of that for her. She's going to try out, perhaps. She hasn't read it yet, I'm sure. I'm leaving out the major, perhaps the parade example of Jesus' obedience and his going to death on a cross. Not pleasant. No way to be pleasant. And instead focusing on these kind of social costs. But that's coming, so prepare for that. Now, though it may seem counterintuitive, I think that Jesus' otherness is the sort of thing into which we're specifically invited to build a similar relationship of intimacy with and obedience to the Father. So his character, I think, in this respect, is not only to be admired, but it's also to be imitated. Now, Asha actually, in her talk of 2 weeks ago, both paraphrased and then quoted Henry Nouwen, and both of them I think were worth bringing up again. So here's Asha's maybe first quote on the board. Jesus' whole mission, his whole invitation was not to believe in him, but to believe in the relationship that was possible with the Father. That's her kind of trying to remember what offended her in Henry Nouwen. Here's Henry Nouwen. Jesus' life is an invitation for us to believe in the relationship between himself and the God who is his Father. This very same relationship is available to each one of us. Go check out Asha's talk and hear about how she was pretty sure that was wrong, and found herself working into a place where that kind of became the crowning point of her talk. I wholeheartedly agree, and I think there's plenty of reason to think that Jesus actually was doing just that. Jesus invites his disciples, in whose line we follow and who we imitate, into the stream, first of all, of communication with the Father. I do not call you servants any longer because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I've called you friends because I have made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father. So the communication, but also then the intimacy of that communication. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. That's in John 17:21 for those who are curious notes. It dropped off the slide. Oh, there it is.
Cool.
All right, one more. The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but my Father who dwells in me does his works. Very truly, I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these. Now, I'm not sure that the word work here is, I didn't look up the Greek, but it's probably some great work of power. But I think it's also, well, the one who follows me and believes in me is going to do the sorts of things that I do. And I think that includes a practice of spending time with the Father, of formation in the presence of the Father. I take it that the words Jesus does are not actually just limited to ones that might come to mind initially, like the big ones, healing and casting out demons. I think his discipline and his obedience and word and deed to the things that he finds there are the sort of thing we're invited into too. In fact, he would say, a verse or two later, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. I think Jesus locates the core of following him and distinction in as just this kind of obedience. And I think that's actually the cutting edge for us, that last bit. Not keeping commandments so much in the sense of thou shalt not murder, although please do keep that one. It's important. But I think with a lot of us hearing, other ones are important too, I think sometimes hearing Jesus is hard. I think it's perhaps hardest with the magic 8-ball approach. I think it's easier by far in the context of the fullness of relationship. A relationship that involves gratitude for the gifts of God, reflection, petition, the expression and shaping of thoughts and desires and needs in the presence of God. I think it's a much easier place to hear from God and be formed by God than the magic 8-ball approach anyway. But I think as difficult as hearing can sometimes feel for us, that the real cutting edge place for us, that the point of our growth is actually obedience. And I'll say a word about that in a second. If the worship team would like to come up. We're getting that close. Maybe if someone could come move the communion elements so I don't have to multitask. So I want to summarize. There are a few elements, I think, of Jesus' character, in case they weren't clear. Aspects of the person of Jesus that the Lord would highlight to us today for our further engagement, and especially our invitation. Engagement perhaps in the remaining time of worship and communion and prayer that we have here together, but also especially throughout the week. So these two aspects of the character of Jesus. Jesus deliberately and regularly seeks the influence of the Father in what, for lack of a better term, we call the practice of prayer. He invites us into that practice. As I do these things, so also you. Now I and folks in my home group, those of them who are good home group members, have this year been doing a practice called the Ignatian Daily Examen. It's a sort of method of reviewing one's day and examining one's conscience, developed by Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits in the 16th century, which I find to be a great way of doing this. If you want to talk to me or someone else in our home group about that, that's a practice of prayer that I found really is a pretty important site for having an actual relationship with God the Father that includes things like being grateful for the gifts I've received. It includes things like processing experiences and emotions from my day. It includes things like looking ahead to the things that are coming. It includes, some days my favorite one, the opportunity to recognize things that suck in my life and confess them and invite the intervention of God, this practice of prayer. I've also done a little bit of fixed hour prayer these days. I especially like the midday prayer, where I'm actually just praying kind of written prayers, giving me kind of words that center me or decenter me in the midst of things that I'm doing. I'm sure a number of you have robust prayer practices going on already. There are probably some of you who haven't found such things, and so I think one of the things that the Lord might be leading all of us to do in one way, I'm not saying Lord is leading you to do, you have to say, but to consider kind of what your practice of prayer like, what in the ways in which you're kind of making good on Jesus' invitation to kind of come into a place of influence by the Father. Second thing, Jesus' otherness is a consequence of his obedience, I think, largely, primarily. That's where we see his otherness, is where he actually obeys, where he lives out the things that he hears in prayer. Now, there's a decided subtlety and privacy even to hearing from God. There are shades of perception, conscience. No one else except God really has access to that space, and I think we can get away with perhaps not following through on the things that we hear there. And I feel like we experience little social cost, at least immediately, and not pursuing kind of the obedience of things discovered kind of in that space. But I feel like the Lord would challenge some of us to reconsider the fruit of hearing as obedience, and especially obedience where there's a kind of a social cost in it. Don't hear me saying I want you to stand outside anywhere with a placard. I mean the kind of obedience where your actions kind of unaccountable, sort of doesn't make sense in the kind of norms and expectations of your context, but would make sense with sort of outwards and other only insofar as it's flowing from obedience. I think the Lord would invite some of us to seek forgiveness and empowerment by the Holy Spirit, specifically to obey, and also to continue on this path of being formed by Him despite the social